So today I'm talking about challenges of the notion of semiotic agency. I'm a biologist by education, and I was always fascinated by this discipline and trying to develop something like theoretical biology. And at some point, I realized that I need to focus my attention on what I call semiotic agency, which is a generalization of the notion of organism. So the notion of agency is neglected in science. And there is, of course, a long historical background of this notion, and it's mostly negative. So people try to avoid this notion. Daniel Dennett says that talking about agency is folk psychology. And so that's what we are doing all here in this conference. We are doing folk psychology. And probably many people think that biosemiotics is a kind of time bomb in their representations of the world, and they think that it's too much danger in what we are doing, so it's better to call it folk psychology, so it's basically something non-existent. That's why I ask questions. Why do we really need the notion of agency? Is the notion of agency is simply combining apples and oranges together, but they're not really belong to the same thing? So I try to expand this notion relatively far broadly, and there are lots of replies that this should not be done. But I think that this notion is the central part of what we are doing, and we need to continue doing that if we want to integrate biology with humanities, philosophy, semiotics, and other, also with cybernetics, computer science, robotics, and so on. We need to explore organism-like entities that are not organisms, because there are a lot of them, and we need a name for that, because sometimes we are talking about organisms, but we mean something different. We mean maybe cells, we may mean metabolism inside cells, but we need a more valid terminology and defend this terminology from critics. That's what important. And these are organism-like entities include parts of organisms on different levels, also superorganisms, and even autonomous artifacts that humans do. But not only humans do, it appears that cells also do autonomous artifacts. Every cell has ribosomes, which is nothing more than autonomous artifacts. It's like a 3D printer that is making complex molecules, and all these self-organization nanoparticles like actin polymerization or tubulin polymerization. It's also something like small organelles that are self-organizing. They're doing something based on their properties, but they're not only their properties, but they are receiving signals from other components, and they are interacting, communicating with other components within cells, and it's a community that has a kind of organic integration. So that means that biosemiosis exists not on a single level, but it's nested deeply from subagents at the molecular level, cells, organs, tissues, organisms, superorganisms like colonies, like families, and in humans, it's also nations, governments, businesses, And who knows, maybe there's Gaia, which is also a kind of superorganism, but it's not completely, its organization has not been fully completed. It's still in the process of emergence. And finally, develop non-mechanistic approaches for exploring agency in respect to their individuation and indeterminacy. There's no consensus on the meaning of semiotic agency. So Daniel Dennett was one of the critics of agency, and so he tries to make it a single level. So for him, agency is a computer, is an organic computer. And he says that that consciousness is explained. That's his claim in one of his books, because consciousness is just a computer. And here is concentrating on the notion of mind, and sees mind in different levels, including bacteria. But all his treatment of agency is through the metaphor of computation. So even if he uses semiotic terms such as meaning, interpretation, Umwelt, and habit, we still feel that all these terms for him are just shortcuts for pointing for multi-level computation, nothing more. So that's why I put this paragraph comparing cybernetics and semiotics. So what's the difference between Daniel Dennett's approach and our approach? Cybernetics is focused on algorithm, whereas semiotics is focused on meaning making. So that's the difference. So how can we explain it? So cybernetics is based on optimality. So if you have several algorithms, there is always one superior algorithm which should be kept. So that's why cybernetics is always following just one path to the most efficient algorithm. And that's it. Whereas semiotics looks at the diversity of meaning, which are qualitatively distinct. And each kinds of meaning requires its own handling, its own means of interpretations. Like images should be treated completely different from texts. And different texts, like poems and novels, should be also treated differently because they are different kinds of communications. So that's why semiotics is not collapsing to a single algorithm. It's always very plural, whereas in cybernetics, for each task, there is one algorithm. Okay. Then, most biologists assume that only organisms are agents. Is this sufficient? I assume that it's not, because there are lots of processes in which organisms are emerging in a long-term process. Like the origin of life is basically the origin of organisms, but initially they are not like contemporary organisms that are much more simpler. They are simply networks of some chemical reactions encapsulated in some form of group so that they can be subject to group selection. Then cellularization, it's again a transition from single cells. They can slowly start integrating into colonies. These colonies then start differentiating, they're separating their functions. So it's a very long process by which multicellular organisms emerge. And the first multicellular organisms, they do not look like organisms at all. They look like colonies. Then now we know that there is a reticulate evolution, which is the term that evolution goes like a network of processes that interact with each other. And this includes niche construction, this includes a transfer of genes between lineages, and many other processes. Artifact making also. Cell components originated from precellular self-organizing agents like coenzymes or virus-like, and so that's why we should consider these systems like ribosomes and viruses seriously as subagents of the cells. Okay, one of the objection to this view is that subagents are not real agents because their autonomy is incomplete. However, all organisms have incomplete autonomy. And their degrees of autonomy. There are some organisms that have very high autonomy and they can colonize bare habitats where nothing, almost no resources exist. But most organisms are built their life on the top of the existing ecosystems. So they merge into very complex ecosystems and try to integrate there. And integration includes adaptation and dependency on other components in the ecosystems. So their autonomy is incomplete. Especially parasitic organisms. They are highly specialized usually, and they depend on a particular type of their hosts. And biologists even deny the status of living organism to viruses. Why? Because viruses cannot synthesize proteins on their own. However, lots of organisms, parasitic organisms, depend on their hosts for producing specific components of their metabolism, so they cannot produce many components, and these components are produced by the host organism. And they use a signaling system of their host organism to complete their life cycle, and their life is strongly dependent on the life of their host organism. So they're basically, it's such a complex organism has mixed identity because its identity combines the identity of the host and identity of the parasite. And nobody knows which of this identity will win at the very end of this cycle. So it may be virus will kill the host cell, or maybe the host cell will find a way to kill the virus or inactivate the virus. There is even more discussion about the agency of autonomous artifacts. So there is a great resistance of biologists to accept the notion that autonomous artifacts are somehow related to life. So they try to keep this distinction between living and non-living systems very strictly. Whereas I propose that semiotic agency should transcend the living and non-living world, but in a very particular way, because life starts on the basis of water-based chemical networks, and only then very highly organized life like humans can build artifacts that are made of silicon. So it comes only at the end of the evolution. However, even regular cells, they have artifacts like a ribosome. Ribosome is an artifact, basically. So it's probably initially was a symbiont of other cells, so parasites. So it was independent, and there are signs, there are indications that ribosomes were self-reproducing at some point. So they were like a special, separate species, in the same way as mitochondria in eukaryotic cells. So at some point they were independent bacteria. Now they are dependent. That's why we have to accept a very flexible way of treating, of defining semiotic agency. So here's the scope of agency, and I start here with humans, animals, and all organisms are steps of including the notion of enlarging the notion of agency. Then, that's the core agents, all organisms. However, besides organisms, we need here to include organism parts, autonomous organism parts, and superorganisms. And finally, at the third step, we even include autonomous artifacts and superorganisms based on cultural relations, which are typical for humans, but also some primitive organizations exist probably in other biological species. So we know, for example, a slime mold makes a fruiting body. So the single cells are moving together and making a fruiting body, which is a superorganism, and it completes the life cycle of the slime mold. But it's like humans are going to work, so they're aggregating together, they're going by subway, and then coming together to the same building, and then they're doing common job. So there are some parallelism like that. So agency is a material entity in its niche with some autonomy and goal-directed activity guided by interpretation of science. So I mentioned material entity. What do I mean by material entity? So I mean it's in pragmatic sense. So we can basically point to this agency, even if it is a computer virus. So we don't know exactly where it is in the memory, but with special tools we can localize it. We can still localize it and somehow affect it. So it is accessible. That's the important things. So that's the difference between hypothetical agents which are not material, like ghosts or angels, because we cannot make any experiments with them. We cannot isolate them unless we believe that drawing a chalk line around us will help us to protect us from evil forces. But then we need statistically proof that this indeed affects. So far, such proofs were not successful, although several people tried to do some scientific research of these non-material bodies. So that's why I limit analysis of semiotic agency only to material entities. Okay, superorganisms, yeah, I said that. Symbiogenesis, okay, good. Now, next slide. So levels of semiosis in agents. So here we talked a lot about consciousness, and some people think that consciousness is a global feature that is common to all living systems. And some even think that it's not just living systems, but also the whole universe is conscious. And they say that galaxies are conscious systems, and star systems are also like living systems. So it's such kind of pansemiotic or pan-living hypothesis. However, Here I, following the principles of biosemiotics, limit semiosis only to living systems and their autonomous artifacts that are derivatives from the living systems. And life starts with protosemiosis, which is signal-based sensing, where no reality is assumed beyond the signals that are received. So this is basically the know-how without knowing what. So these organisms like bacteria, they know how to get nutrient, how to move around, how to respond to stress conditions, how to reproduce. But they don't know what factors are affecting them. Because they receive only abstract signals from the environment, like the glucose receptor is bound by glucose, and then some protein is phosphorylated inside the cells, and this is an abstract symbol that has nothing to do with glucose itself. So the cell has no information of the structure of the glucose molecule. Okay, so then goes eusemiosis or real semiosis. So here sensorial patterns, a large number of sensorial signals are integrated into complex patterns, and they are then linked with individual objects, which are then recognized or categorized as object types. So we observe this in some processes in even single eukaryotic cells. And such processes are mitosis, which is very complex cell division, which operates with very complex structures. It's not just individual molecules, it's enormously large structures. Or apoptosis, for example. Probably membranes are very important for that, especially in such processes as phagocytosis. So phagocytosis is interaction with large-scale object, and it needs to sense that object, it needs to operate with this object. Finally, it becomes food for them. And then eusemiosis has several steps of complexity, increasing complexity. So the most simple eusemiosis is innate. So that means that it's solely instinct-based cognition, which is adjusted by context-dependent plasticity, which is either sensitization of habituation. So I don't call this learning yet. So although several biophysicists and even biologists like to expand learning to this step, but I would like to keep it away and to reserve the notion of learning for higher level processes. Why? So I care about notions that are already stabilized in science, and it's better not to change them. So that's why I do not change the notion of life. So even there are some systems that resemble living systems, but if they are not considered living in the contemporary science, I would like to keep this distinction as it is. And the same thing with learning. So learning is very highly anthropomorphic notion. So we know that animals are learning, that's for sure. No problem with that. Like insects are learning, octopuses are learning. But I would not try to expand this learning, which is this consciousness step, to the innate semiosis only where only plasticity is operates on the short-term basis. For example, some mollusks are basically in this innate step, but because they are very easy to operate, they appeared to be, I'm talking about the sea hare mollusk. It's a large mollusk, and it's studied by physiologists a lot, and they consider it as a Pavlovian conditioning. But if you look at the experiment they use, it's not Pavlovian conditioning because it's simply dominating effect. So one stimulus appears to be dominating and it suppresses all other stimuli. That's it. So it's a very simple physiological effect which has nothing to do with Pavlovian conditioning, which is based on very complex recognition of complex stimuli, like in Pavlovian dogs. Okay. Okay, I'll go a little bit faster. So identity of an agent. So identity is what agency takes care of. It's one of the goals, important goals of an agent is to preserve its identity and propagate this identity in their progeny, in space, by migration, and so on. And it has material identity is important, functional identity. And also here I talk about indeterminacy, of, I already mentioned host-parasite relations, it's indeterminacy. Also life versus death, it's the classical indeterminacy, and the paradox of the Schrodinger's cat is based on this particular life and death indeterminacy, which is not that important for quantum mechanics than for biosemiotics and biology. So it's basically the matter of biology. So we don't know if our neighbor is alive or dead until we call him and talk to him or open the door and ask if he's okay. So agents are able to preserve their core identity despite of indeterminacy and external disturbance. So they can even lose some portions of their identity, like the lizard loses its tail just to save its core identity, to survive, and then it can regenerate the tail. And agency is beyond physics and mathematics. Why? Because attempts to define life through physics or axiomatic methods are shortcoming. Organisms have their own laws of change via goal-directedness that are not prescribed by physics. So they do not contradict to physics, but they're not prescribed by it. And features of agents that so far are not explained by physics include these living capacities to grow, differentiate, reproduce, interpret science, produce subagents, and so on. And here are my conclusions. I will just leave them as it is. So, and questions are welcome.
Okay, I really love your notion of sub-agent, which gives me a term to be used even for the abstract we are supposed to write about last week's workshop. But throughout your presentation, you have talked about the evolutionary process as some agents coming together and forming higher level agents. I would add also delegating some part of their autonomy to the new level agent. But don't you think there are also instances where complexity increases in evolution, not by coming together in that combinatorial sense, but sometimes an agent developing, becoming more complex by developing lower level structures and processes and giving them partial autonomy and creating thus downward sub-agents? What would you say?
Yes, so this process was initially described by Peter Turchin, who considered metasystem. Yeah, metasystem transitions. And he explicitly talked about both ways. So there may be metasystem transitions on the highest level, but they also occur on the lowest level. It's like gene duplication. So it appears that the number of genes increased exponentially in evolution. And I know what is the doubling rate of the genetic complexity of organisms. It's doubling in approximately 300 million years.
Like levels of agency, like imagine that you find semiotics is a house, and each room has, that you have different functions, like you have the plumber, you have the electrician, and then you have levels of organization, and agency would pertain to each room, as you would have new particular tools.
Okay.
So, for example, in the RNA world, that's completely different. Cellular signaling, then you go to all the levels, evolution levels, and the notion of agency, I don't think you carry from the top all the way down to the bottom, because it's irrelevant to this world, because they don't have the capacity for what is expected of them.
Yeah, so at the lower level, we have tools and we have simple agencies that cannot be dissected further. So it's not infinitely divisible thing. So at some point, we have elementary agents that cannot be divided further. So, and they work mostly like thermostat, or so they're similar to mechanical devices. But they're not very interesting. However, this notion of this nested agency, nested meaning making, resolves the puzzle of agency. So it explains that higher agency working only in respect or considering the capacities of our affordances at the lower level. And this level relies on the even lower level. So this is nested agency. That's why it's important, it's impossible to make life in a vial or in a glass. Because it's a multi-level system which requires basically millions of years of evolution. So the lab experiments too short to do that. The same thing with the origin of life. It's absolutely impossible to make life in the glass tube. It will never happen.